Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Welcome back, folks. Nice to see you in the virtual world again. I hope you did enjoy your midterm break, Monday and Tuesday off. Tuesday at least had very pleasant weather, so I hope you got outside even just for a little bit. So I hope you had a moment to relax a little bit. Welcome back, and I hope you and your families are well. This morning we're going to get started in chapter 6. That's our content for today. Just taking a very quick look at your syllabus. Hopefully it will make all of you feel better that today is actually the middle point of your semester. When we start next week's classes, you will actually be closer to the end of your semester than you are to the beginning of the semester. So hopefully that makes you feel better that, the end really is in sight. And we have a lot of work to do, but we're starting to close in on the bottom half of our term together. Okay. So before I get started, do you have any questions or comments at this time? Anything that's been on your mind? Okay, all right, folks. Well, then welcome back. Let me just respond quickly to a comment in the chat window. All right. Okay, folks, let's get started here. I'm going to share my screen with you. And we'll bring up our note-taking document. Here we are. Okay, so we are in chapter 6. The title of chapter 6 is the skeletal system bone tissue. Okay, so if you think about it, we've already achieved a lot in the course. For lab exam 1, you all became experts on identifying bones. In chapter 4, you started to get comfortable with with tissue characteristics, and we're continuing to build that knowledge with some visual identification skills in lab at this time. Okay, but the point of this chapter is we're really going to talk quite a bit in detail about bone histology itself. Okay, so not so much identifying the bones, but what do we find that makes up the molecular anatomy of the bone, and a little bit about the physiology of how bone tissue actually functions. Okay. All right, so let's get started here. I'm going to start with a brief overview of bones, just to give you some basic starting comments here, say some things that you may or may not be aware of depending on your study efforts. Okay, so obviously, when we talk about bones, we appreciate that the primary purpose of bones is to support our soft tissue, right? The skeleton provides a physical, sturdy framework to hang our muscles around and other soft tissues, so it provides support and a limited amount of protection, right? You think about your rib cage protecting your internal organs. Think about the bones of your skull protecting your brain, the vertebral column protecting the spinal cord. So bones provide both support and protection. Okay. We appreciate that each individual bone of your body, each individual bone, whether I'm talking about a metacarpal bone, or whether I'm talking about a giant bone like the femur, every individual bone of your body is an organ. It's an organ, okay? Each bone of your skeleton is an organ, okay? And remember, an organ is a three-dimensional object in the body that's made of multiple tissue categories. And as you will see as we cover throughout this chapter, that you will find multiple tissues that make up the molecular anatomy of bone, okay? Each bone of your skeleton is an organ. It's kind of an odd way to think about it, right? When people hear the word organ, they think about your heart, your liver, your spleen, kidneys, that kind of thing. And after chapter 5, your skin, right? But each bone of your skeleton meets the actual definition of an organ. Okay, so let's see what else we can say here. Bones have special substances in that allow them to manufacture blood cells. So bones manufacture blood cells. Okay. Inside many of the bones of your skeleton, you're going to find a special material called red bone marrow. Red bone marrow contains stem cells. They actually contain a subtype of stem cell called an adult-derived stem cell, which has the ability to manufacture both red and white blood cells. Okay. The process, well, let me ask you this in the chat window. Here we go. What is the name of the process bones perform to manufacture blood cells? What do we call this? What do we call this process, folks? Have you come across this in your reading? Any thoughts? Okay, I'm going to go with the first comment in the chat window just to keep us rolling. Tony, you're absolutely correct. It is hematopoiesis. Carissa, you are also correct because an alternative name for the same process is hemopoiesis. Those are, Tony and Carissa, you are both simultaneously correct, okay? The process of manufacturing blood cells is called hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis. Very good. All right. All right, so bones manufacture our blood cells. Well, let's see, what else do bones do? Okay, bones actually store minerals for us, okay? Think about how much internal volume and surface area there is for all the bones of our skeleton. That prevents an incredible opportunity to store materials that might be beneficial to our physiology. So bones store minerals. Okay, bones store minerals. And when I'm thinking about minerals at this time, I'm thinking of two minerals that are super mega important for our physiology of our bodies to work correctly. And I'm talking about calcium and phosphorus minerals. Okay, we'll have much more to say about that in the future, but remember, calcium is super important for muscle contraction, super important for nervous system function. Phosphorus, what can we say about phosphorus? Well, phosphorus is the dietary source of phosphate. And phosphate, of course, is super important to manufacture ATP, biochemical energy, so we can actually contract our muscle fibers and walk across the room. Okay, so bones store minerals, and they also store triglyceride. Okay, the triglycerides are stored in yellow bone marrow. Okay, and so the yellow bone marrow is actually a energy storage depot. We might even think of the yellow bone marrow as the equivalent of an Energizer battery, right? I mean, it's not literally equivalent. We don't literally have an Energizer battery in our bone marrow, but the yellow bone marrow stores biochemical fuel in the form of triglyceride. This is a storage depot or quote unquote battery to help provide the body with an energy reserve. Okay. All right. So we store material, we store minerals, we store triglycerides. Okay. The skeleton is made of bones, and bone is made of osseous tissue. Okay. We'll be talking about what that really means. We'll be pointing out the characteristics of osseous tissue as we continue through our conversation today. Number 6, okay, the skeletal system. If you hear or read the phrase skeletal system, what do we mean by this? When you see skeletal system, we are collectively talking about the entire framework of bones, pieces of cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. Okay, so the phrase skeletal system collectively refers to the entire framework of bones, cartilages, ligaments, and tendons, right? I mean, you remember the good old days of learning the bones of the skeleton, right? There was a lot to learn, right? But we didn't ask you to learn pieces of cartilage. We didn't ask you to learn ligaments. We didn't ask you to learn tendons at that moment of time, right? There's still many other things to be capable of identifying. Finally, let me mention the term osteology, okay? The term osteology, I want to highlight this here. The term osteology is the study of bone structure and the treatment of bone disorders. Okay. All right. So folks, this is just some starting points to get our cerebral juices flowing a little bit here so we can think about this content. Do you have any questions about these statements? Okay, let's keep rolling then. All right, so we're going to start talking about the typical structure of a long bone. Okay, so in your textbook, I'm taking a look at figure 6.1, right? Figure 6.1 talks about parts of a long bone. Okay, it's just an example of a bone that your textbook is presenting to you, but since it's present in your book and there's a convenient figure that you can look at, this has some utility for us that we can actually talk about it and document things in your notes. So figure 6.1, parts of a long bone or bone structure of a long bone, however you want to label this here. I'll reference this in your notes that you'll want to spend some time thinking and studying this during your private study times. Okay. All right, so as I go down sort of a laundry list of anatomical structures that make up the typical features of a long bone, just try to put your eyeball on figure 6.1 in your textbook and follow along with us here. Okay, so this is an image of a long bone, and when we say long bone, we're talking a bone that has a greater length than width. That's what a long bone means, okay? The phrase long bone refers to a bone that has a greater length than width, okay? So hopefully no problems there. All right, let's start talking about some of the bone anatomy itself. First off, let's identify the middle portion of the bone, which is sometimes referred to as the body of the bone. This is more properly called the diaphysis, okay? Along the left-hand side, figure 6.1, put your eyeball on the diaphysis. Okay. The diaphysis is the bone shaft or body? Okay. Number 3 here, epiphysis. Okay. Epiphysis is referring to the ends of the bone, and of course, there's going to be a proximal end and a distal end. So there's actually 2 ends. So epiphysis is singular and epiphyses is plural. Okay, so I'm going to list it as the plural version since there are 2 ends of the bone. Okay, epiphyses refers to the proximal and distal ends of the bone. Okay. Next, number 4, we need to mention the metaphyses. If you look at your image in figure 6.1 there, you notice that there are also 2 metaphyses, okay? Because there's 2 ends to the bone. The metaphysis is the region between a specific epiphysis and the diaphysis. So it's the in-between zone there. Metaphyses. Okay, this is the regions between each epiphysis and the diaphysis. Okay, so it's here where we're going to slow down just a little bit and talk about metaphysis on a little bit more detail, point out some points here. Okay. So if you look carefully at figure 6.1, what I want you to notice is something called the epiphyseal line. Okay, take a look at the epiphyseal line. Okay, I'm going to ask a question in the chat window. Here we go. Looking at figure 6.1, what region of a long bone's anatomy is most of the epiphyseal line found? What region of a long bone's anatomy is most of the epiphyseal line actually found? Okay. So as you begin to look at that image, folks, I'm starting to see some correct answers in the chat window, and I hope all of you can look at that picture and you can verify what your classmates are saying in the chat window. It is actually the metaphysis, right? It is the metaphysis. So I'm going to document that in your notes. Okay. All right. So let's do this. Okay. Long bones grow in adolescent bones that are still growing. There is an area called the epiphyseal growth plate. Okay. In adult bones, which are finished growing, there is an area called the epiphyseal line. Okay. So in adolescent bones that are still growing, like somebody that's 13 years old, okay, there's going to be an area called the epiphyseal growth plate. In adults that are finished growing, like somebody that's 42, okay, that epiphyseal growth plate that was present in the adolescent bone turns into the epiphyseal line. So what I'm telling you is the epiphyseal growth plate and the epiphyseal line are the same things at 2 moments of time in the development of your body. The epiphyseal growth plate is what's found in the young childhood bones, where the bones are still growing. The epiphyseal line is found in the adult bones. The epiphyseal growth plate and the epiphyseal line are in exactly the same anatomical position of the bone, but the actual tissue composition of the growth plate and the line are different, okay? Notice that the epiphyseal growth plate and epiphyseal line are the same are located at the same location within the metaphysis. Okay. Notice that the epiphyseal growth plate and epiphyseal line are located at the same location within the metaphysis. Okay. And let me come up here and just document that the epiphyseal growth plate is made of cartilage. Okay, the epiphyseal growth plate is made of cartilage. The epiphyseal line is made of osseous tissue, which is to say that the cartilage of the epiphyseal growth plate, as you get older and you stop growing, it will ossify, it will differentiate from cartilage into actual bone tissue itself, okay? So the epiphyseal line is made of osseous tissue, okay? And let's see here. The epiphyseal growth plate will differentiate into the epiphyseal line as you mature and finish, and let me say, and stop growing, okay? All right. Okay, folks. So, you know, it is a little bit confusing to consider that the epiphyseal line or epiphyseal growth plate, whichever you want to refer to, is not really abundantly present in the epiphysis. It's primarily found in the metaphysis. I'm not aware if there is a historical reason why it was mislabeled that way. It might very well be a historical mislabeling. There are numerous cases throughout the historical development of anatomy as a field of study where things have been mislabeled, and the mislabeled versions have simply stuck, where we continue to teach it that way simply from historical tradition, even though it's not technically correct anymore. This is one example, okay? So the epiphyseal growth plate or the epiphyseal line, as you see in figure 6.1, predominantly it is found in the metaphysis, okay? Question in the chat window. Is this making sense? Am I making some sense to you folks? Are you okay? All right. Any questions? Okay, so, you know, if you were a crime scene investigator, if you were a forensic scientist, you know, you might find a skeleton, you know, somebody might have been killed or murdered or whatever it might be, and you might find a bone. If you can identify a bone that still has good structure intact, you'll be able to tell where the person who has passed away is an adult or a child based on the tissue composition of the epiphyseal growth plate / epiphyseal line. If it's an epiphyseal line, if you find osseous tissue, you're dealing with an adult. If you find cartilaginous tissue in that same location, you know you're dealing with someone who was not finished growing yet, and so is an adolescent, okay? All right. So let me just ask a quick little silly question in the chat window. Do you remember an old show on Fox TV called Bones? Okay, maybe some of you watched it, maybe some of you watched it in reruns, but you get the idea here is that, the primary star of that television show was an expert at anatomy. And so, they would use anatomy terms on the show. Okay, let's continue, folks. So now we know diaphysis, epiphyses, metaphyses. Let's continue here. Number 5, let me mention the articular cartilage. Okay, articular cartilage is a very thin layer, okay, very thin layer. You see it at both the proximal and distal ends, right? You see it both the proximal and the distal ends. Articular cartilage is a very thin layer of hyaline cartilage that covers the part of the epiphysis where the bones form a joint, where the bones form what is known as an articulation with another bone, okay? Very soon we will be talking a little bit in more detail about some of the characteristics of joints in the skeleton, okay? And so there are different kinds of joints, but please know that when we talk about a joint, we're talking about something that is more properly referred to as an articulation, okay? So articular cartilage is going to be found at the proximal and distal ends of the bone. It's made of hyaline cartilage and it covers each epiphysis. Okay. There is something peculiar about articular cartilage that you should know. Okay. So we're telling you articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. Okay. Hyaline cartilage from your time studying chapter 4. And I know that's a lot because there's a lot of content in chapter 4. Hyaline cartilage typically has a region known as the perichondrium. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is go back in chapter 4, if you have your book open and available, take a look at table 4.6. Take a look at table 4.6. In my physical version of the textbook, it's page 135. So take a look at table 4.6. Okay, in table 4.6, you have hyaline cartilage in panel A. And let me ask you this in the chat window. In table 4.6, part A, what color is the perichondrium? What color is the perichondrium? Okay. All right. So again, I'll keep moving along, but thank you, Lauren and Christina, and for other folks that are contributing. I really appreciate it. Okay. The perichondrium is pink. Okay. So folks, most hyaline cartilage of your body is going to look like the image you see in panel A of table 4.6 in chapter 4. Articular cartilage, which is the topic of our conversation right now. Articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage, with the exception that articular cartilage does not have a perichondrium. So articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage that lacks a perichondrium, and that's a little bit unusual. You don't find that any other place in the body, okay? So we'll go ahead, and when you're ready, you can go back to figure 6.1 again. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, I cut my notes off here, didn't I? Let me rearrange things here. Okay. Should have been down here. There we go. Okay. Let's continue here. So articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage, which lacks a perichondrium. Okay, this is unusual. All right. Also, you appreciate that just like all cartilages, articular cartilage lacks blood vessels. And so if you were to damage the articular cartilage at a joint, it's going to be really hard to repair that. It's going to take a long time for that injury to heal itself. Okay. Okay. All right, let's take a look at some other things here. Number 6. Okay, so take a look very carefully at figure 6.1, and panel A. You see the entire long bone. Go to the terms on the right side of panel A, the long bone, and take a look at the phrase or the term periosteum. Periosteum. Okay, the periosteum is a layer of tough connective tissue that actually wraps around the fabric of the outer surface of the bone tissue itself. So you have a layer of connective tissue. It's a tough connective tissue membrane that wraps around the bone tissue itself. And the purpose, well, let me state that, and then we'll write down the purposes here. So periosteum is a layer of tough connective tissue that wraps around the surface of the bone. The periosteum does a number of things for us, a number of things for our bones. The periosteum, first off, it acts as an attachment point for ligaments and tendons, right? So tendons, muscle to bone, ligaments, bone to bone. When we're connecting bone to bone, those ligaments are going to ultimately attach to the periosteum around each of the bones being tethered. In a similar fashion with the musculature, the periosteum is going to be the connecting surface for the tendon that interfaces with the muscle. Okay, so periosteum serves as the attachment point for ligaments and bones. The periosteum also serves as an anchoring surface for blood vessels and nerve endings that want to penetrate deeper into the three-dimensional interior of bone. Okay, acts as an anchoring surface for blood vessels and nerve endings which penetrate deep into the interior anatomy of the bone. Okay, if that phrase anchoring surface seems odd to you, just think about an analogy. Think about the room you're sitting in right now. Now, obviously everybody's sitting in a different room in a different house, but most houses have rooms that have windows. And think about the wall of your room as an anchoring surface for a door or as an anchoring surface for a window. That's what I mean by anchoring surface. The wall of your room provides a structure, which is a foundation for something like a window or door to be part of. So the wall is an anchoring structure for a window or a door. In the same analogous way of thinking, the periosteum is an anchoring surface for blood vessels and nerve endings that need to enter into the interior of the bone to keep the cells happy. Okay, You can see this a bit more if you take a look at figure 6.3. Take a look at figure 6.3 on page 182 or somewhere close to that, figure 6.3. Okay. And what I would ask you to look at on figure 6.3 is panel A. Along the right-hand side, you see the boldface term periosteum. Okay. And simply take note that there are blue and red colored blood vessels penetrating deep into the interior of the bone. Isn't that so, right? In other words, there are arteries and veins that are penetrating into the interior of the bone tissue, and they are anchored or maybe tacked down or stitched down to the surface of the bone with this periosteum membrane. Okay, so that's what I'm referring to when I talk about this. All right. Let's see here. So now we have two P terms. By P terms, I mean we have two words that start with the letter P that are often confused by students: perichondrium and periosteum. So let me give you just a little bit here to help you distinguish these two words that start with the letter P. Okay, so perichondrium, periosteum, they seem like they could be the same thing. They sound dangerously similar to each other when we're studying, and all of a sudden the wrong one pops up into our mind when we're trying to answer a question on an exam. Okay, so let's try to clarify these two things. If you think about them individually, they make sense, but then things start to get confused in the mind. So, a point of clarification. And we'll say a couple things here. The periosteum and the perichondrium are both made of the same type of tissue. They're both made of dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, and if you don't recall what that looks like, certainly go back to chapter 4 and have a look at it. Periosteum is the membrane that covers bone. Periosteum covers the surface of bone. The perichondrium is a membrane that covers most hyaline cartilage, but not articular cartilage. Okay, so let's just take time and read those two statements, numbers 2 and 3 again. Okay, the periosteum is the membrane that covers bone. The perichondrium covers cartilage. So periosteum is specific to bone. Perichondrium is specific to cartilage. Okay, that's really what you need to think about when you're trying to distinguish these words on an exam. Okay, and finally, there's something else here that I'm just going to allude to, but I'm not really going to make a big deal of in our discussions. Is in this chapter, which perhaps you've started reading, you will find that you will find different scientific theories, scientific explanations, scientific models for how our bones actually form when you're in your mother's womb, developing before you are born. There's primarily two modes of bone formation: intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification, which are figures 6.5 and 6.6. And so let me say something here at this time, because we're talking about periosteum and perichondrium. Okay. Let's see here. So go ahead, please turn in your textbook to figure 6.6. Take a look at figure 6.6. Okay, so if you have figure 6.6 open in your textbook, notice that there's different stages of development of the bone that are being described in your textbook. And each stage is highlighted by a colored ball that has the color blue. So blue ball 1, blue ball 2, blue ball 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so here's my question in the chat window. Hold on a sec. In figure 6.6, stage 1, what term do you see at the top of the primitive bone image? What term do you see at the top of the primitive bone image? Okay, thanks Rebecca and Sierra, Christina, everybody that's taking a look at this. You notice you see the word perichondrium, do you not? That is correct. Now what I want you to do is take a look at stage 3. Okay, notice stage 3 along the right side of the bone. Notice that we now see the term periosteum. Okay, so let me ask this in the chat window. Do you see the term periosteum at stage 3 of figure 6.6? Okay, all right, good, excellent. I appreciate that you're looking at this. Okay, what I want you to be aware of is that when your bones are being formed in your mother's womb before you are ever born, your early skeleton actually develops as a mold of cartilage. Okay, your bones start out as pieces of cartilage, not as actual bones. Okay. And so, Rebecca, I see your question. Hold on just a sec. So our bones start out as molds of cartilage, and then through differentiation processes, the bone turns into actual osseous tissue. So what I'm saying is, if our bones start out as shells of cartilage, we can expect to find a perichondrium, because perichondriums cover the surface of the cartilage. And as the cartilage differentiates into bone, we can expect that the perichondrium will differentiate into periosteum. So the periosteum develops from the perichondrium as our bones are developing before we are ever born. Okay. So the periosteum differentiates from the perichondrium while the bones of our embryonic skeleton are being created. Okay. And I'll reference figure 6.6 here, endochondral ossification. Okay, so the periosteum is a differentiated version of the perichondrium. It's perichondrium when the bone is actually made of cartilage, but when the bone is true bone, it's now the periosteum. So the perichondrium transforms into the periosteum during development of our bones. Okay, so Rebecca, in the chat window, you're asking, from how it looks, doesn't the periosteum start in stage 2? Yeah, I would agree with you, Rebecca, that stage 2 is showing you the periosteum. It simply was not labeled in your textbook at stage 2, and I wanted to be able to point out where the word was, but I agree with you. And remember, take the stages with a grain of salt, because when you're talking about a stage, there's a whole span of time, right? We're talking about a process that starts now, and a whole bunch of other things happening between the first time I said now and now, right? It's like taking a picture of somebody running down the road. You only get a snapshot at that instant of what the person's body looks like, but you miss all the other things, the other instances of time that you can't see with one photograph, okay? So be careful not to put too much stock into simply learning stages, because we're learning a process that happens over time. Okay. All right. Okay, folks, any thoughts, questions, confusion? All right, let's go back. We're going to finish up our coverage of long bone anatomy here. Just a couple more things I want to point out from figure 6.1. Let's see here. I'm going to come back up here to my periosteum note and put a letter C here. From letter C, you would appreciate that the periosteum, this membrane, it actually connects to the surface of the bone through special fibers called perforating fibers, which are also known as Chpt fibers. Okay, you can probably see that best on figure 6.3. Okay, so I'll document this in your notes. Okay, the periosteum attaches. I'm going to say it differently. The periosteum is stitched. The periosteum is stitched to the surface of bone by perforating fibers, which are also called Chpt fibers. Okay, perforating fibers are simply very thick bundles of collagen. Okay, so this membrane is literally stitched to the surface of the bone with these perforating fibers made of collagen, chains of collagen. Okay, and you can kind of see that if you look very carefully at figure 6.3, panel A, bottom right corner where you see the term perforating fiber. Take a real close look at that. Maybe you can zoom in your textbook and you can see these little fibers there. Okay, so that's how there's a tremendous amount of structural integrity there between the membrane and the surface of the bone. Okay, I'm going to continue here. Let's talk about the bone marrow cavity, also known as the medullary cavity. Again, figure 6.1. Okay. The medullary cavity is also known as the bone marrow cavity. Okay, and realize that this is a hollow space. This is a hollow space inside the diaphysis. And appreciate that, remember, what we're looking at in figure 6.1 is a long bone. It is a long bone. Okay, so generally speaking, in long bones, you're going to find yellow bone marrow in the medullary cavity. You're not going to find red marrow there. You're going to find yellow marrow. Okay, so within long bones, this medullary cavity will store yellow bone marrow. Okay, and here's a rule of thumb to consider when you're thinking about bones. Here's a rule of thumb. When we're talking about red bone marrow, that's typically going to be found in the epiphyseal and metaphyseal regions of long bones. Okay, with long bones, okay, red bone marrow is primarily found in the epiphyseal and metaphyseal regions. Yellow bone marrow is primarily found in the diaphysis. Okay. If we are talking about short stubby bones, such as, your vertebral bones, pelvic bones, ribs, some bones of the skull, you're primarily going to find red bone marrow in those bones and not so much yellow bone marrow at all, because there's just not a lot of internal volume space to store yellow marrow. Okay, so red bone marrow is primarily found in the epiphyseal, metaphyseal regions of long bones. Yellow bone marrow is primarily found in the diaphysis of long bones. Okay. For short stubby bones, you primarily find red bone marrow and very little yellow bone marrow. Okay. All right. Final thing here, and then we'll be moving on to the next topic. Number 8 is the endosteum. Take a look at that in figure 6.1, the endosteum. Okay, the endosteum is a very thin membrane that lines the medullary cavity. Okay, so what I want to emphasize here in the endosteum is that the endosteum is the membrane that contains the stem cells that allows the body to manufacture new bone cells. Okay, if you have bone that's damaged, fractured, injured in some way, as long as the endosteum has not been damaged, then the endosteum will be able to manufacture new bone cells to heal the bone. Okay. This membrane contains stem cells that are capable of manufacturing new bone cells. All right. Okay, folks. So if you think about it, in our course here, we've already, we've already identified some areas where we were talking about stem cells, right? Remember when we talked about the stratum-based cell of the epidermis containing a layer of stem cells that allows the body to manufacture new keratinocytes? Okay, so there's stem cells there. Here we're identifying the endosteum inside our bone, which has the capability to manufacture new bone cells. And the broader point I'm trying to make is, as you look at different tissues or different organs made from these tissues, you're always going to find a germinal layer of cells, that is a stem cell layer of one type or another, that has the capacity to reproduce and produce new cells that replenish that specific tissue or organ cells when there's damage or caused from physical injury or infection or whatever might be happening. Okay, so you find stem cells all throughout the body in different stages of genetic maturity. Okay, and that's something that we'll have to talk about later because it's quite a deep topic. Okay, folks, do you have any questions about some of the anatomy we've presented to you from figure 6.1? Okay, let's keep rolling here. Let me know if you need anything. I'm going to go to the next page here and start my next topic. The next topic, as I turn the page in the textbook, is near figure 6.2, and the broader topic is histology of bone tissue. So this is going to be bone tissue histology. If we do a deep dive into the bone, what are we actually going to find? Okay, well, remember, bone is a connective tissue, right? Bone is a connective tissue, and so that means not only do we find cells, we find extracellular matrix. So let's start there. Let's start talking about extracellular matrix. Okay, the extracellular matrix of bone is made of about, and I'm taking some numbers out of your textbook, is made of about 15% water, about 30% collagen fibers. Okay, so chains of polymerized collagen protein linked together. And 55% what is known as crystallized mineral salts. Okay, so when we talk about crystallized mineral salts, we're talking about calcium and phosphorus minerals that have crystallized. Okay, so let me ask you this in the chat window. Have you ever seen or eaten rock salt candy? Okay, have you ever been in vacation in maybe Williamsburg, Virginia? That's where I remember seeing rock salt candy. Okay, and so if you think about what rock salt candy looked like, okay, it looks strange because the actual sugar of the candy crystallizes and you get these weird geometries and things like this. But long story short, what I'm saying is you're going to find a similar crystallization process in the minerals of the extracellular matrix of your bone. So I'm not telling you you have rock salt candy in your bone, but I am telling you you have small crystals in the extracellular matrix of the bone that provides part of the physical strength and structure of your bone. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this. Okay. The hardness of your bone is due to the crystallized salts. Okay, that provides the hardness, the firmness of the bone. Okay. Bones are living tissue. They're pretty hard as things go. They're not the hardest things in the body. That would be the enamel of your teeth, right? But bones are still pretty hard. Even though bones are hard, you know, they are somewhat flexible. I mean, they need to be a little bit flexible to handle some physical stress so they don't break or snap and because they're overly brittle. Okay, so a bone's flexibility is due to the collagen fibers that are part of the extracellular matrix. So if we think about the physical characteristics of bone, there's hardness that I'm describing. So I'm going to underline that. And there's also flexibility. So a bone's flexibility is due to the presence of collagen fibers. Okay, so we have hardness due to the crystals, and we have flexibility, a little bit of stretchiness, a little bit of elasticity there due to the collagen fibers. Okay, and so the analogy that I typically bring up here, and if it works for you, use it. If it doesn't work for you, find one that does work for you. Think of your own analogy, okay? So in the chat window, let me ask you, hold on a sec. Here we go. Can you visualize what I mean by steel reinforced concrete? Have you ever been driving down the highway and you see a construction project, maybe a new road or bridge, and you see these big clumps of cement with steel tubes, steel rebar sticking through? That's kind of the analogy that I think is appropriate for the structure of your bone, of the extracellular matrix, where the mineral salts would be the concrete, that's the hardness, and the collagen fibers would be the steel sticking through the concrete that provides a little bit of flexibility to these very hard structures we use to build our road systems with. Okay, so think steel reinforced concrete here, okay, where the concrete is the crystallized minerals and the steel is the collagen fibers. Okay, All right, so that tells you a little bit about the composition of the extracellular matrix of the bone, okay? All right, let's continue here. Let's talk about cells, okay? So figure 6.2 tells you about the types of cells you will find in bone tissue. All right, so we have to start with a warning here, or at least a cautionary note. You know, I told my 7-year-old son the other day that bones are alive, and he didn't believe me. Well, he's 7, so there's lots of things he doesn't believe when dad tells him things. Okay, so but bones are alive, right? They're organs, they're made of multiple tissues, they're dynamic living materials. And so it should not be a surprise to you when I tell you that the actual composition of your bone and the types and numbers of cells in your bone vary throughout your lifespan and the various developmental stages you go through. Certainly the types of cells you're going to find predominantly in the embryonic skeletal bones is different than you find in the adult bones. Certainly the types and concentrations, numbers of bone cells you find in your skeleton vary when you have fractured a bone and there needs to be some wound healing, okay? So the composition of bone is not static, and the population and types of bone cells we find in our bones ebbs and flows and varies based on your health status at any given moment of time. Okay, so remember that the composition of bone is not static. The chemical composition of the extracellular matrix and the types and quantities of cells present in the bone changes throughout your life. Okay, so we're going to list some bone cells down that maybe you have more or less of them at different stages of your development. I'm not telling you that you always have all of these cells in a great density and great amount. That's not true. What we're saying is at various times of your development, you will find different types in different quantities. Okay. Chris, I see your comment. Thank you. All right, so let's do this, folks. All right, so the first kind of cell that I'm going to mention is the osteoprogenitor cells, which you see in figure 6.2. Okay, osteoprogenitor cells are also known as osteogenic cells. Okay, the osteoprogenitor cells, which are also osteogenic cells, these are unspecialized stem cells, folks. They are bone stem cells. Okay, these are unspecialized bone stem cells. Boy, I cannot spell today. Bone stem cells, which have the capacity for mitosis and have the capacity to reproduce and form new bone cells. These osteoprogenitor cells are bone stem cells, and they themselves originate from what you might remember from chapter 4, one of the embryonic connective tissue types, which is the mesenchyme. These are unspecialized bone stem cells that differentiate from the mesenchyme. Okay. Okay, so if you don't remember mesenchyme, take a look again at chapter 4. Okay. What we'll highlight here is the osteoprogenitor cells are the only bone cells to perform mitosis. They're the only kind of cell that retains their reproductive capacity in the bone. Okay. All right, folks. So now you know the foundational cells that repopulate the bone tissue when there's damage or some kind of cell death caused by infection. It would be the stem cells of the bone, which are osteoprogenitor cells. Okay, next we have osteoblasts. Okay, osteoblasts are sometimes known as bone building cells, if you will. Okay, they are really the first cell category that began a process known as bone deposition, which is laying down large quantities of extracellular matrix. Okay, let's see here what else I can tell you. Osteoblasts. Okay, if you look at figure 6.2, notice that in the image of figure 6.2, there's a phrase there above the osteoblast. The phrase is this: from bone cell lineage, right? Suggesting that there's an ancestry, there's a genetic relationship, there's an evolutionary connection from one kind of cell to the next kind of cell, just like you are related to your father, and your father is related to his father, which is your grandfather. There's a relatedness between these cells, okay? Osteoblasts differentiate from osteoprogenitor cells. Okay. Osteoblasts manufacture and secrete collagen and other materials necessary to build the extracellular matrix. There is a disease state that is sometimes found in adults. Let me see if you know what this is, or let me just ask you if you've ever heard of this. Okay. Have you ever heard of a condition known as acromegaly? Have you heard of acromegaly? Okay, so Christina hasn't. Okay. All right, so acromegaly, let me see if I can bring up a Google image of someone with acromegaly. Okay, I don't know what I'm going to find here, so this is not super gross, but if you're sensitive, just be cautious here. Here we go. Maybe this is a good way to start. Okay. There's a normal hand on the left and a hand that's an acromegaly hand of an acromegaly patient on the right. And obviously what you're noticing here is that the fingers are thicker, correct? And that's the general feature that I'm trying to represent to you right now. Folks that suffer with acromegaly have an overly aggressive thickening of their bones, and a lot of that is due to an overdeposition of the extracellular matrix caused by overactivity or overpopulation of the bone tissue with osteoblasts. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Acromegaly is a disease state characterized by an aggressive thickening of your bones and is thought to be caused by abnormal activity of osteoblasts depositing too much extracellular matrix. Okay. When you have acromegaly, you do have problems with other systems of the body, particularly the cardiovascular system, because if you think about it, the extracellular matrix contains these crystallized minerals, right? Which contains, among other things, calcium. So you may have too much calcium floating around in your bloodstream, which can impact how your muscle tissue functions, in part your heart. So people with acromegaly often have cardiovascular issues. Okay. All right, so there's osteoblasts. These are the bone building cells, folks. Okay. Next, we have osteocytes. Osteocytes are the, osteocytes are what we would think of as the mature bone cells. So certainly as an adult at this moment of your life, you have a higher concentration of osteocytes than you did when you were, say, 2 years old, okay? So osteocytes are the mature bone cells. Okay. Osteocytes, typically in your adult body, are kind of like mom and dad. And by that, I mean mom and dad, what do they take care of? Mom and dad go to work every day. They pay the bills. They keep food on the table. They keep the heat on in the wintertime. They do all the things that are not very sexy or fun, but is absolutely essential to life, right? So osteocytes are the mature bone cells. They're involved in the normal daily metabolic activities of the bone tissue. Okay, osteocytes will, in fact, as you can see it being inferred from figure 6.2, osteocytes do differentiate from osteoblasts. Okay. Gotta watch my time here. Okay. There's an interesting other bone cell that we should put in your notes at this time, and that would be the osteoclast. Okay. Osteoclast. So let me put up here by osteoblasts, right? By osteoblasts, okay, osteoblasts are responsible for bone deposition. Okay, laying down extra volume of extracellular matrix. Osteoclasts are responsible for bone resorption, which is dissolving the material, particularly the crystallized minerals of the extracellular matrix, and pumping those minerals into the bloodstream, because those minerals are needed by other organs and tissues to function correctly. Okay, so osteoclasts are responsible for bone resorption. Okay. And by bone resorption, okay, we mean the breakdown of the extracellular matrix. Okay, so okay, let me do it this way. Let me define. Okay, so so let's do another point of clarification. Okay, because the reason I do this, folks, is because I've seen many students over many years of time get topics confused. Okay, so bone deposition, we build extracellular matrix. And that would primarily be the domain of osteoblasts. Bone resorption, we break down extracellular matrix. That's primarily the domain of osteoclasts. Let me say this. Be very careful here. I'm going to say this. I'm going to say this, and you are still going to get it wrong on the test. Bone resorption is bone resorption. It is not bone reabsorption. Okay. Resorption is not the same thing as reabsorption. Be very careful about the words you use and how you use those words. Make sure you're very clean in your language. Okay, because words do matter in a technical field like we're in. Okay, folks, I'm out of time here. I have a few more notes to give you on osteoclasts, but we're doing pretty good. So when we meet next Tuesday, I'll finish this topic off and quickly be telling you about compact bone tissue and spongy bone tissue. Okay, so we didn't have lab this week. I guess that's a good thing. I hope you're finding some time, downtime, but also some personal study time, because we'll be back into the thick of things next week. Do you have any questions? Okay, folks, have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week, okay?